It is a great honor to have Professor Fazal Rizvi as a visiting professor to Universiti Brunei Darussalam, particularly with us in the International Comparative Education Research Group. And over the past week, Professor Rizvi has given wonderful and stimulating lectures on various topics related to globalization and education, as well as implications to international and comparative education. And so today I would like to probably to continue some of the conversation that you've already opened up to the audience. And so perhaps to start with, I would love to ask how and to what extent comparative education needs to be rethought or constructed or imagined in the context of globalization.
Comparative education emerged something like 150 to 200 years ago as a way of countries and systems learning from each other and trying to understand how you can actually think about certain generalizations about improving systems of education, improving pedagogy, improving assessment systems, improving governance systems. And that is precisely what it was designed to do. And of course, in so designing, people assumed that each system and each country was self-contained, that its boundaries were very clear, and that it was a fixed black box, so to speak. In that sense, comparative education was based on assumptions of what is now called methodological nationalism. That is, the nation was the primary unit of analysis. What globalization has done is disturbed and unsettled that assumption. That is, it's no longer possible to simply look at a nation and national system in its own terms without also thinking about how it relates to a whole range of global forces, global connections, and global imaginations. So, for example, the work of transnational corporations and international organization impacts greatly on how educational systems attempt to reform themselves. And in that sense, you cannot understand a system without also understanding how external forces affect the internal dynamics. And I think increasingly in international education, international and comparative education, we need to pay attention to those questions about global networks, global connections, global forces, and global pressures, and try to understand how systems relate to each other and work with each other and not simply learn from each other, so that it can be conceptualized, it can be imagined that countries can work together within regions, for example. So, for example, in this region, ASEAN, there is a great deal of cooperation. In EU, there is a great deal of cooperation. So you cannot understand a system like Brunei, or in Europe's case, a system like Sweden, without also understanding the work of international and regional organizations. The issue really is trying to understand the various networks and various connectivities that define the relationalities between systems. And that actually gives rise to a whole range of new questions that transcend the kind of questions that comparative education has traditionally asked and attempted to research. So that's where I think things are at the moment, is how do you understand global pressures, global forces, global connections, global imaginations, and so on, as a way of understanding a system and its boundaries too, because boundaries do not exist per se, but are constructed and devised and change their dynamic. So you need to understand how those boundaries and the ways in which systems are defined is not a static thing, but continuously changing.
Yeah, and so in such a process, what kind of challenges have you observed?
Well, we continue to believe that the nation is the sole determining agents for making policies in education. that is not in fact the case. Okay, and as a result, we need to determine what other forces are influenced. But it's not possible to actually just simply name those policy pressure agencies. You have to actually decide how and when they have the kind of impact that they might have. So the problem, the challenge becomes which pressures do you regard as important and which pressures you let go by, and which country pressures internal dynamics of a nation more than some other institutions. So, for example, it might be possible to say that World Bank impacts on system in Laos much more so than ASEAN does. But that requires some kind of judgment. And those judgments are not easy to make because they require certain understanding of the systems in order to be able to decide which factors are more important. But at the same time, factors can't be understood unless you also understand a whole range of other dynamics. So the question of what are the lines of relationalities that are important and which are less important becomes a major challenge. Nation state still remains the most powerful actor in determining policies, but does not have the degree of autonomy that it might have once had. Of course, during colonial days, colonized countries didn't, but most countries in Europe and other places did. Now, that authority cannot be taken for granted anymore. It has been, if you like, supplemented or replaced with a whole range of other centers of authority, whole range of other aspects of authority that's coming from elsewhere, like transnational organizations, like NGOs, like other countries who may actually provide aid and grants, like the kind of countries that you collaborate with. All of those things now impact on making of policy of a national system. And I think international and comparative education now needs to look at those pressures in ways that are much more open-ended than was the case when you assumed a nation to be relatively self-contained.
Right, yes. And so I pick up a very important term in your series of talk, conversion. So could you elaborate more on
Sure. It? Well, what I argued in one of my lectures is there is evidently a degree of convergence that we are witnessing around the world, where most of the systems of education are following similar kind of programs of reform. So, for example, privatization, corporatization, vocationalization, and indeed casualization can be observed in just about every system. That suggests that there is a degree of convergence. But convergence is never complete. Convergence is always in the process of happening.
Right.
And convergence can be, or pressures for convergence can also be resisted by particular countries, such as Brunei, for example. Brunei may decide that it doesn't want to go down the road of privatization to the extent that it is being pressured to do. Okay, so it does have some autonomy to be able to do that.
Right.
Of course, some other countries which do not have the financial capacity to resist global pressures do not enjoy that autonomy. So, for example, Laos, which is a country in this region, does not have the autonomy that Brunei has to sort of saying we don't want to go down the privatization road. The World Bank loans and grants quite often are conditional upon countries like Laos, which are the recipients of grants and aid, are forced to comply. So that's actually what I mean by convergence. Convergence happens as a result of a whole range of factors, circulation of ideas, various consensus, various patterns of competition, which require a common criterion against which to compete, and sometimes coercion. All those processes are involved in affecting and making convergence possible. But the capacity to resist convergence is also there. But the different countries and different systems with different financial backup have different capacities to resist.
To resist, yes. And so obviously such phenomenon has tremendous impact on knowledge and knowledge production.
Yeah.
Yes, so could you comment more on the, knowledge production and whole benefits in the whole process and the power structure and as well as the disjuncture of globalization?
Well, the countries that are in position to develop those systems of comparison, those systems of testing regimes, for example, are much more likely to benefit. So, for example, some of the Western countries, the members of OECD, which are clearly the main beneficiaries of PISA, the program of international student assessment, are likely to benefit from PISA much more than countries that are not OECD members, because the instrument itself has been developed for those countries, the member countries, and understandably, they're likely to benefit. But once these systems are taken up by other countries, which are not part of OECD, then to that extent, they have less of a role to play in its construction. Now, OECD would deny that. OECD would say that every person, every country that is involved in developing PISA has equal say. That's not really the case. And I think to assume that it would be the case is somewhat an optimistic view of the work of OECD. Yeah. Right. I think some of the constraints that other countries feel about how to develop the examination systems or the assessment systems themselves don't realize actually how they're constrained by a particular tradition of knowledge and what is regarded as more important things to assess. So assessment itself is done against certain things that are regarded as important things to assess. Yeah. Okay, and in that sense, the currency of the content of assessment is often much more important, and that is determined clearly by. And of course, this is where the hegemony of English becomes really quite important as well, given that most of the designers, most of the architects of PISA reside in English-speaking countries or English-speaking institutions like Princeton, like ACER, like University of Melbourne, like Boston, like Montreal, and so on, which are major centers of assessment expertise. They're all in the West. Yes. None of them are located in Global South. So that would clearly imply that the countries where tests get made and in the language in which they get made are likely to be privileged in a whole range of different ways. And in that sense, the politics of knowledge, of tests and of curriculum becomes really quite asymmetrical one. Unequal one. And I think study of those inequalities and those asymmetries of power itself becomes a topic for comparative education to explore.
Yes. And also, I remember a fascinating example you gave in one of your lectures, that you had a group of 11 PhD students and you asked all of them to review a policy, is it blueprints?
Blueprints,
Yes, blueprints from a particular country, and then you ask them to compare and analyze and discuss. So if you could,
Well, basically, about 10 years ago, I asked a group of students at the University of Illinois, where I was teaching then, to take a country of a different cultural traditions and different political traditions, countries like Singapore on the one hand and China on the other, to actually have a look at the last major educational report recommending reforms and try to see what the structure was. What is it that they were attempting to reform? Right. What did they consider were the problems that needed to be solved? And to our great surprise, perhaps not so as much now in retrospect, but then the structure of these reports were almost identical. All of them started off with the language of global imperatives and the global crisis and the crisis of education in responding to the imperatives of technology and imperatives of global economy. And all of them were presenting similar kind of solutions like privatization, corporatization, vocationalization, casualization, steering at a distance, and public management. All of them did that. And that doesn't matter whether they were liberal democratic country or indeed a country that had a very strong communist tradition. We were quite surprised with that, which means that our imagination is quite often limited in the sense of what we regard as the problems that in education that need to be addressed and what the solutions might be. And that's basically what our exercise showed. And some of the students have written about that experiment and have tried to show how and why it is that such convergence is even possible. Of course, the convergence is the level of policy narrative. By the time it gets to the school level, and by the time it goes down to the level of the teacher in the classroom, things may be very different. Because there is a huge distance between policy narratives and practices, actual practices. We didn't study practices, so we don't know how much convergence at the level of practice there is. But we do know at the level of policy, and especially the broad brush policy, there is a huge convergence.
Yes, and so actually, as we talk about conversion, we also probably talk about the mobilities of ideas and of people and of practices that probably enable such convergence, right?
Sure.
Yeah, and so and I remember, of course, many of us have been profoundly inspired by your work on mobilities and immobilities and what form of inequalities, right? That are embedded in those practices or in those, I would say, experiences of mobilities across the globe. So if you could comment further on the intersections of globalization, mobilities, and even transnationalism. Yes.
Well, I mean, the point that I want to make relates to how most people think about mobility. They think about mobility of people. And indeed, in the field of international education, much of the focus has been on the mobility of people. But what people don't understand and don't actually quite often research is how with mobility of people, cultures and ideas and money and all those other things move as well. And with those movements, we need to actually understand how ideas move and how ideologies move and how finance moves and how capital moves and how money moves, and try to understand what is the nature of the relationship between mobility of capital and mobility of people, for example, and how do people move and travel around and come back with ideas that are perhaps those globally converging ideas.
Yes.
So, for example, if I go to British Educational Research Association Conference, Australian Association Research Conference, and European Conference of Educational Research, and American Educational, similar kind of ideas are presented by a similar group of people who are mobile and who are policy entrepreneurs of one kind or another. And they talk similar kind of language. So when these people come back with expert knowledge from these globally mobile people bringing back globally mobile ideas, they actually present to their governments similar kind of solutions to the problems, which may actually be very different. But their mindset has been determined by their constant mobility and constant participation in these conferences where the solutions to the various problems and indeed the characterization of the problems are being discussed in ways amongst people who have become quite used to the talking to each other. So, for example, I get to talk to you, and you get to talk to me on a regular basis, and we develop a sense of similarity.
Sure.
You know, and as a result, you go back to Vietnam, and I go back to India or Australia, and go back with similar kind of ideas. That's kind of understandable. But these processes need to be empirically studied, rather than simply assumed. So I've actually presented a theoretical construct of how it may be possible that the convergence happens. But we haven't actually understood exactly what the processes and experiences and activities and languages and relationships that exist to enable that happen in a particular circumstances across particular sites.
Yes, so I guess that is a very important aspect for international comparative education.
Of course.
To take up.
Of course.
Yes.
So you can start off with the convergence and sort of saying there appears to be convergence, but then ask a certain range of questions. And these questions are, to what extent is there convergence? What is the limit of that convergence? How can that convergence be resisted and is being resisted? And what are the consequences of this convergence? And how is it that is undermining the traditional purposes of education?
Yes.
See, those are the kind of new questions that comparative education now needs to ask. So we haven't actually said the convergence is our final theoretical answer. It is actually the beginning of the research, you know, sort of saying there appears to be convergence. Let's find out how, when, and against what kind of activities, and against and at different sites and different organizations and different notions.
Definitely.
So you can't assume that convergence affects the United States in the same way as it affects Papua New Guinea. You know?
Definitely, yes.
Okay,
yes.
but we can't just simply say that they are converging differently.
But
the
how?
question is how,
yes,
and why.
Yes.
Okay, so those are the kind of questions that become really quite important for comparative education to look into.
Exactly, and also as you are, after decades of doing work on globalization and education, have you noticed any particular significant actors in that space? For example, those who are not conventional actors in higher education, for example, now suddenly claim the stage and become a lot more significant.
You mean in terms of people or in terms of agencies?
In terms of agencies, across the board.
OECD certainly has become a very, very powerful player. World Bank was always a powerful player, but now has become significantly powerful. UNESCO is a powerful institution that also has an effect on the ways in which nations work. And of course, the Millennium Development Goals and more recently Sustainable Development Goal 4 are examples of convergence. But exactly how they have been interpreted and how SDG might be interpreted are things that are open for us to research. In terms of people, there are a large number of theorists who are working on these issues. And yet, I would also say that there are some people who are continuing to work in ways that is still largely methodologically nationalist. And there are some people who actually deny the charge of methodological nationalism. They're sort of saying there's nothing wrong with methodological nationalism because nation states are such powerful entities and such overpoweringly important that to abandon focus. But my answer to that is that nobody is abandoning nation states. It's just that saying that the nature and the scope and the character of nation states is changing and changing rapidly. And we need to understand that. And methodological nationalism prevents us from understanding them in their dynamism.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. And now that I'm aware that you have been doing some work with Finland and in Finland, right? And so, and I'm very curious to see your view of the so-called the Finnish model and how the world has become so obsessed with the Finnish model. Yeah.
Well, I think the world was looking for an example that they can look for. You know, these questions are very difficult to answer. So if you can actually identify a system,
right,
you know, which can be used It's conveniently,
proxy.
as a proxy for the final solution, so to speak. Then I mean, that's one way of sort of. In other words, we need to understand that the world is hungry for new solutions to educational problems, and Finland, because it did so well in PISA, sort of. On the other hand, at the same time, I should say, Finland did a lot of self-promotion as well. It went around saying people, we are the best, come to us and we'll teach you how educational systems can be improved and how you too can be the best. Of course, if everyone was the best, then the notion of best loses its meaning because best is a comparative concept. You see what I mean? But within Finland too, basically, the serious scholars don't actually buy into the hype. There are some people who I call policy entrepreneurs, global policy entrepreneurs, who push the idea of a Finland miracle really very hard because they have their own interests that they want to pursue. But then there are serious scholars who believe Finland has got its own set of problems, including problems of not knowing how to deal with emerging diversity, for example, cultural diversity, how to deal with the problems of new urban spaces, how to deal with problems of migration and refugees. Also, the assumption is that Finnish systems do not know, as well as, let's say, Australian system, how to deal with issues of cultural diversity and cultural exchange, because it's relatively new to them. So Finland can learn a great deal from Australia. So these are the serious scholars. But, the policy discussions are taking place at two levels. At the level of political rhetoric and political symbolisms and political opportunism. And then there are serious scholars who are sort of saying, yes, there is an element of truth in Finland doing well. But at the same time, I mean, Finland is a system which has done better. But, when you start looking at where the third country is, which is Finland, in the league table, and where the 10th country is, the difference is minute and perhaps statistically insignificant. And yet those who come 10th have a panic that they're falling behind, etc., etc. Okay, and Australia, that's happened. I mean, Australia doesn't do all that badly. Except it happens to be 10th rather than the third. But the difference between third and 10th, there's a difference between third and 50th is considerable, but third and 10th is hardly any difference. 560 to 580, big deal, not very different, but, and also Australian system is pretty good in certain other things, and as a result, the league tables really do quite a lot of injustice, and perhaps to the Finnish system itself. And I think that's some of my colleagues point out to me, this hype around Finland is good for some individuals and perhaps the Department of Education and Department of Foreign Affairs in Finland, but it's not very good to teachers and who need resources, who need help, and who need all kinds of new reforms to be able to do the job that they like to do.
Wow. So that is definitely an unexpected, or maybe how could I say, something that we probably, it's not in our imagination, right?
Yes. Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, and also, there is an element of ethnocentricity involved too. I mean, Singapore does better than Finland, and people go to Singapore too. Yeah. But they do not get all starry-eyed about Singapore in the way that they do Finland. And you start saying, what's the difference? Well, I know what the difference is.
Okay, if you could reveal to us.
Right. Well, I think everyone who's listening to it would know what the difference is, Okay. So I don't need to say it,
Maybe that's the topic for the next conversation.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
Yes. And so I remember, in one of your talks, someone in the audience did ask you a question regarding hybridity.
Yeah.
And then you responded pondered, something like, if I remember correctly, so hybridity itself has been subjected to many criticisms. Yes. And so for you, hybridity is not the answer to the question, but it is the beginning of the question. If you could elaborate more on that, yes.
Well, in the 1970s and 80s, when we worked with a particular set of sociological categories, hybridity was an interesting intervention. It was an intervention that showed cultures to be dynamic and cultures to be changing forever. And a change, of course, were taking place as a result of their interaction with other cultures and other cultural practices. And this interaction was producing new cultures that we called hybridity, and that needed to be pointed out. Okay, but I think 20, 30, 40 years later, we need to think about hybridity very differently. We need to start saying hybridity is ubiquitous. It is normal. It is a default position. Hybridity is happening everywhere. Hybridity is happening now.
Now, yes.
Okay,
yes.
right now, And we need to send, what kind of hybridity, how, and what hybridity and what hybrid forms are dangerous and damaging and have negative consequences, and what forms have positive consequences. So what I'm saying is we must actually now begin with the assumption that hybridity is ubiquitous, and then sort of ask ourselves the further questions. The trouble, of course, is many students in particular present hybridity as an answer rather than an initial question. So what I'm saying is it used to be a question, it used to be an answer, and it was an appropriate answer. Okay, but now that we have accepted that answer, new questions emerge. Questions always beget new questions. Once you answer, there is never in social sciences, or indeed any form of knowledge, the answer itself is without further questions. And I think that's what we need to do. I mean, it's the case in geography or history or sociology, You give an answer, but that raises new questions. And I think in education in particular, we still present hybridity as a conclusion of our study. Exactly. So you told us hybridity, but for me, that doesn't tell me anything because I assume hybridity. Exactly. So the fact that you've revealed through your data that there is hybridity, big deal. So what?
Too trivial.
That's right. So basically, an answer that was once significant has become trivial, and as a result, so self-evident that it doesn't need to be asked anymore. Doesn't need to be advocated anymore. But that doesn't mean that there are a whole range of questions about hybridity that we need. We need to understand the political economy of hybridization. We need to understand how certain political structures and certain structures have potential to develop hybrid form that will favor some people and not other people.
Not others, yes.
So certain hybridities are really quite innocent and quite neutral, but other hybrid forms are really quite problematic in the sense that they perhaps reinscribe, reproduce certain inequalities, social inequalities, and that those hybridities lead to structures and practices that are incredibly damaging to some people.
You could give us some examples.
We are here in Brunei, the hybrid forms are, for some people, quite damaging. So when you produce kind of a look-alike of McDonald's, then that's a hybrid form because you don't have the same menu as McDonald's has. But the form is the same and the practice is the same. The fast eating is the same. In that sense, you could argue that is compromising certain cultural traditions of slow eating or trying to actually eat in a community rather than the fast eating that underpins the idea of McDonaldization. Okay, so what I'm sort of saying is that there are examples like that. But one's recognition of hybridity should give rise to a whole range of new questions. And those are the questions that I'm interested in, rather than simply sort of saying, this particular practice is a hybrid practice.
You all know that, right?
Big deal. Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
That's great. Yeah, and also related to that is a concept of location or locatedness. And I remember you making a lot of emphasis on that concept. So like in the context of ASEAN, for example, how is it or to what extent comparative and international education should engage with the locatedness from within ASEAN?
To start off with, locatedness and locatedness or location does not exist in nature. It has to be constructed by groups of people for particular interests and against particular structures of power. Okay, so what you regard as local, is not ever. Sometimes it's a nation and sometimes it's not. So you can say that when we talk about local, we talk about Brunei. It's a small place, and you can say, but that's not necessarily a local. It could be argued that this community here is a local that is very different to a poorer part that's a different kind of local. So located, there's a production of locality. It's not necessarily reproduced, it's produced all the time. And of course, it's produced against the backdrop of a whole range of global pressures and global connections and global imaginations. As people are thinking about locatedness differently. The best way I can explain it is when countries get divided, the location changes. There was once 2 locations within Vietnam. Now there is 1 location. There was once only one location. Now there are 7 locations in what's called India. With all these different countries that were once British India. Of course, sometimes location is so exactly where the borders of the local are. Needs to be investigated and understood in broader terms than simply against an assumption of empirical fixedness. It's not something that simply can be described empirically. You have to understand how what we see as local itself is produced through certain historical and political processes. So that's actually how I think about location. And of course, global is always involved now, and increasingly so. So the kind of things that we do, our identities, our sense of belonging, our institutions, our practices, and the dynamic nature of those is affected by a whole range of other factors that are outside that local, but are giving local a different meaning and different significance. So I think the politics of locatedness is really important. How we think about a particular village. A student of mine has just finished a PhD thesis in Philippines. He has tried to understand the located and the location of that particular village, and how the locatedness of that village has been affected by almost 80% of young women going to work as nurses and maids in other parts of Asia and elsewhere. That has had a deep impact on how the location itself is thought about and what meaning people attach to the locatedness. All of a sudden, the located or location of this village is as related to Hong Kong as it is to Manila, which is the country capital. Of course, Manila has certain say about how the local is defined, but given that people are moving, ideas are moving, media is moving, and have certain connections to Hong Kong, Hong Kong is not entirely irrelevant in the production of that village or an understanding of that village.
Of that location too.
Of their location, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so that actually brings me to another, how could I say, actually a very important work of yours in which you theorize, conceptualize, and also extensively discuss the capacity to imagine. Yes, given that the world has become so globalized and transnationalized. So, of course, our imagination has been very much shaped by that. So, could you comment on both the limits as well as the...
Well, imagination is always there. Human beings are imagining beings. They can think. In fact, it is probably true to say that human beings are the only species on the world that can plan its future. Okay, that can think about its future.
Right.
You know, the monkeys that I see in
Outside
Brunei,
apartment, right?
outside this building,
Yes.
are not able to imagine what tomorrow is going to be. Okay, human beings can. So imagination is always there. Okay, as a part of human condition. But exactly what capacity we have to construct our imagination depends on within the power structures that we are located and the kind of things that we have been trained to do. So imagination can be trained. You know, we can train for imagination. You know, imagination is not simply each individual has their own imagination, and the capacity to imagine is precisely that. Is trying to develop people's capacity to imagine alternative futures, new futures, different futures, better futures, and work with others. And also, the imagination is never done individually. It is always done with groups.
Socially.
It's a it's social imagination that we're looking at. We inherit certain imaginations because those are the hegemonic imaginations that we are part of, but we can challenge them. We can think about them differently. So it may be argued that current conceptions of globalization is thought in terms of neoliberal imagination.
Yes.
But that's not necessary. Globalization and global interconnectivity can be imagined in different ways.
Yes. So what might be those different ways?
Well, I mean, there are a whole range of different ways. I mean, religious imagination is simply one example, given that we are here in Brunei, you know, where people are imagining their future in different ways. I mean, it was really quite interesting. Some of the people who asked very, very difficult questions were really questions about, to what extent are we able to imagine alternatives, okay,
yes.
and regard them in ways that are very different to the converging hegemonic definition of globalization. And I think that's a good question.
Yes, yes.
But it's a question that is predicated on the assumption that it's possible to do so.
Right.
And I think it is. You know.
Yes. And now I note down 5 keywords that are all connected to imagination in your talk. So relationalities, historicity, reflexivity, criticality, and imagination. So I don't know if you could even elaborate on how they are interconnected.
Well, they are interconnected.
And leading to one another. Yeah.
It's not possible to actually historicize without understanding relationalities. And it's not possible to understand relationality without historicizing how that relationality has been constructed and has come to be. Okay. Similarly, the criticality is important because we need to imagine what has been inherited differently. And similarly, the notion of reflexivity is important because we need to understand who is the knowing being is. Who are we that are doing the imagination? Right. And how is it that our tools for imagining themselves have been historically constructed and historically inherited, even if we are in position to criticize some of those tools. So imagination comes together. Basically, it's the idea of not seeing imagination simply either in terms of individual aesthetic imagination, which is one tradition of thinking about imagination, or simply thinking about it as a social imagination, but trying to actually unpick the various ingredients that go into the formation of imagination. And that's actually the work that I've been doing.
Yes.
And that's where those terms are important to me.
So is it the book that you are currently writing?
No, it's there in quite a lot of my
already,
work.
Already in 2010, the Globalization.
No, well, in that book and a large number of papers that I have written. I mean, I keep on coming back to those 5, what I call epistemic virtues. Okay, so I've written quite a bit on epistemic virtues. This is in tradition of Aristotle, virtues, ethics. Okay, but I'm trying to apply that logic of Aristotle to logic of epistemology.
Well, and how about the book that you shared with us? You are currently working on for Routledge, that reflecting on the 30 years of working on globalization.
Well, it's just simply a book that sort of says, when did you first encounter the term globalization? Okay, why did you become attracted to it? How did you understand it when you first encountered it? What work you have done, and how has your understanding of globalization changed as a result of changing conditions and changing literature, changing theorizing. And it's part of all that, and I'm trying to tell a story that is at one level, a story of globalization, at another level, my own story. Or perhaps the best way of putting it is my story of globalization.
Right.
That's actually, so, but my here is that really quite important. I'm not trying to present a definitive a textbook account of globalization. I'm presenting a highly personalized account of how I have engaged with the notion of globalization over the last 30 years. So that's what the book is about, and I hope it gets done.
Yes, and when may we see it in print?
Well, probably around August. That's actually what is due at end of February. So I'm hoping that I will have done it by then, and it takes them 4 or 5 months or 6 months to put it out.
So do you have the title for the book now?
It's just simply called Globalization Education. It's a very simple title because it's in a series where senior scholars, people who've been working with a particular concept or particular theorist for a long time. So there is a book on Marx in education, there's another book on Freud in education, there's another book on Foucault in education, another book on Freire in education. And then there are books like Technology in Education and Literacy in Education, James G. Okay, yes. And so it's basically a book that invites people who've been working for a long time, who are long in the tooth, okay, to reflect on how they have worked on a particular concept or a particular theorist. So that's what the series is. And because it's got a formulaic title, ... and education, I didn't have any choice but to call the book with that name.
How are we going with time, Liam? It's fantastic. Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, but I mean, I have one final question. Am I allowed? Yeah, sure. Yes. So Fazal, you've been sharing with me that probably, maybe in the coming years, you would be thinking about, or you would actually be writing essays.
Yes.
You love writing essays. Yeah. So what could you maybe share with us what one or two of them might be?
Well, I mean, essays would be quite, essays could be on race. I mean, basically, I want to write essays from a particular vignette.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So I pick up a vignette that I hear about, somebody describes to me, or something I encounter. And I begin with that, and I theorize that. See, I'm one of those people who doesn't come from theory to description, but description to theory. Okay, or description to theorizing, which is a much better way of
theorizing,
putting it.
Yes.
Okay, so I try to look at something that I've experienced. Of course, there are some theoretical assumptions in my observing it in the first place. But then what I have observed, or the story that I can tell. So almost everything that I write will start off with a story, okay, which I will then unpick in my own way, using the theoretical resources and concepts that I've been working with.
Your capacity to imagine.
That's right. So that's basically what it is. That's basically how I want to do it. I mean, I like students to write their own work in that way, So one of the things that I really insist on with PhD students is to actually tell me the story, what I call biography of the question. And biography of the question. So the question that you're asking, where does it come from? Why is it significant? And then also the biography of you as to why you should be interested or why you are interested in that question. So I try to actually get them to actually write about the significance of the question within some context. And that context includes your personal engagement with the kind of things that you are interested in, that keeps you awake at 3 o'clock in the morning writing your
like
thesis.
You did last night, right?
Yeah, right. Okay. like you do. Okay.
Yes, well, yes.
That's basically what my hope is. My hope is to write things. And so, for example, I might remember a particular story from 1975 that I engaged, that I've been thinking about but have never written about. Well, whatever story, it doesn't matter what the story is. And I'll write the story and sort of saying, this has preoccupied me for the last 35, 40, 45 years. And I've been thinking about it, and this is how I understand it. That's an essay.
I very much look forward to reading your essays.
I don't know whether I would or not, but I'll try to do my best.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Fazal. I know, as always, I have so many questions still, but in the interest of time, right, and then Liam said, cut. Yeah. So I stop here.
All right, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Fazal. That's wonderful to have you with us.